Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to play Baccarat. Perhaps you've gone to a casino and seen this mysterious game, perhaps in a high roller area. Or maybe you're like me and you watch those old James Bond films and wondered what that intriguing but somewhat indecipherable game they were playing was. Well, it is Baccarat, and I'm going to break down how to play for you. We'll talk about the most common variant, and then we'll talk about some different variations you may be less likely to encounter, including that James Bond version. It is at its heart a very simple game, but there are some sort of complicated bits that can kind of confuse the matter. So I'm going to lay it all out so it's very clear, but to show you how simple it is to just pick up and play, I can very briefly tell you all that you need to know. All that happens for you as a player, if you were to walk up to the table, is you're going to place a bet on one of two hands of cards. You'll either bet that hand 1 will win, or hand 2 will win. They happen to be called player and banker, but in this variant, those have no specific meanings. It's just hand 1 or hand 2, and which do you think will win? So you might put your money on the player hand, and once all bets are in, the dealer will deal out 2 hands of 2 cards each, potentially a 3-card hand, depending on a certain set of rules, and the closest of those 2 hands to 9 will win. The dealer will indicate which hand has won, and will pay out bets accordingly. If you win, say the player hand 1, it's paid 1-1. If you lose your bet. If you bet the banker hand, it is also paid out 1-1, but there is a 5% commission, and the dealer will keep track. So all you're doing is betting on whether the player hand or the banker hand 1 or hand 2 will win. And the dealer will handle all of the mechanics of the game. So knowing that, you could walk up to the table in the casino, make your bet, and be playing Baccarat. Of course, it is more interesting if you know what's going on, so I'm going to explain all that. But I hope that showcases a key aspect of Baccarat for you, which this is a game of chance. It is not a game of skill. Your only actions as a player are to bet whether the player hand or the banker hand will win, or if they will tie, which pays out 8-1, but that's a much riskier bet. So this is a game of chance because your only action is to bet. So let's talk about how it's actually played, though, so you can get a deeper understanding of the game. And I want to be clear, what I'm going to explain to you is what is referred to as Mini-Baccarat. So this is what you will most commonly find if you walk into a casino in the US, and really in many places around the world at this point. It's a very specific set of rules. As I said, the dealer is going to handle all of the work. But that is what I will explain, because that is what you are going to generally find. And as such, we're just going to call it Baccarat. Now, if there's Mini-Baccarat, is there Baccarat or Big Baccarat? Yes, and some other variants. And later in the video, I will get into that. But for now, we're going to focus on what you're most commonly going to encounter. Now, as I described for you, at heart, it is a very simple game. You're effectively betting on a coin toss, whether the player hand or the banker hand will win or tie. Despite that being simple, there are kind of two aspects that make Baccarat more complicated in its feel. The first is how it is scored, and that's what we'll look at next. And then how the cards are dealt. I think the tricky thing is not that it's super complicated, but the dynamics of scoring and dealing are particularly non-obvious if you don't know what's going on. So allow me to explain that for you. The objective of the game is for a hand to get as close to 9 as possible. A hand of 9 will beat a hand of 8, but the highest value hand is going to win. If it's a tie, there will be a push. You get your bets back unless you've bet on the tie. Now, if you think of blackjack, where your goal is to get as close as you can to 21, it is similar. But there is no concept of as close to 9 without going over as possible in Baccarat. If someone tells you 9 without going over, that is actually completely incorrect, because the only possible scores for a hand, a 2-card or a 3-card hand, are 0 through 9. And I'm going to explain how we get to that score. It's really not too complicated, but it does take some explanation. So when it comes to scoring, aces are low in Baccarat and count as 1. Cards 2 through 9, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Cards 2 through 9 all count for their face value on the card. An 8 is worth 8 in the tally. Now, when it comes to the 10, as well as the jack, queen, and king, these 4 cards, the 10 through the king, 10, jack, queen, king, these all count as 0 when adding up the total of the hand. Now, some Baccarat players might be raising their hands right now. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the scoring of those in a minute, but just know, if you think of these cards as 0, 10 through king, then you will be just fine when it comes to calculating the value of a hand. So, ace counts for 1, 2 through 9 have their face value. 10, jack, queen, king are all going to be 0. Fairly straightforward. There's one more key scoring detail for a hand in Baccarat. If your total of the 2 or 3 card hand is a 2-digit number, i.e. any total greater than 9, then you drop the tens digit, the first digit of the number. So let's say a hand had a 7 and an 8. These total 15. Because it's greater than 9, 10 or greater, has 2 digits in the total 15. We drop the first digit, so this is a 5. Similarly, a 9 and a 4, 13. We drop the tens digit, so we just have 3. So that is how we end up with scores from 0 to 9 in Baccarat. Mathematically, we take modulo 10 of the total, right? So if you have 6 and 5, that's 11. 11 modulo 10 is 1. I know for all of you it's much easier to think in terms of modulo rather than just dropping the first digit. But that is the mathematically correct way to think about it. But all we do is if we have 2 digits in the number, we drop that first digit. Right? If we have a 10 and an 8, remember this is 0, so we just have an 8. In Baccarat, if a hand is dealt an 8 or a 9, that is called a natural, and play will stop at that point. If both hands have a natural, then the higher one wins, so a 9 would beat an 8. If they were tied, 8 or 9, it's simply a tie. But if there is a natural, there is a winner declared at that point, or a tie, and no further cards are dealt. So 8 and 9 are natural in Baccarat. All right, so let's do a quick review of the scoring. Then I want to dive in a little bit. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it will prepare you in case of some confusing things that you might encounter out there. So we're going to get a little bit more complicated, and then I'm going to remind you that it's simple again, so just bear with me. So simply, ace is low, 1, 2 through 9, count for face value. 10, jack, queen, king are all going to be 0. You total up the 2 or 3 cards in the hand. If the number is 2 digits, you drop the tens digit. 16 is going to be a 6. 17 is going to be a 7. And that is all there is to it when it comes to adding up your hands. Now, there's a reason I want to talk a little bit more about the 10 and the face cards. As I said, this is a bit of a tangent. This is a little bit about how my brain works. But it also may be useful because you might hear people talking about these cards in a different way. And I want you to understand what's happening if you do hear that. So as you saw from the basics of scoring, there's some specific rules about cards in Baccarat. And the game as a whole has a number of kind of specific things that basically just require memorization. Now my brain wants rules to be as disambiguated as possible, to have the general case apply as much as possible without special cases. But there's no way around some of the special cases in Baccarat. But I'm talking a lot, and I want to dive into more why I'm driving at this. The way I learned the value of these cards when I first learned this game is that these were all worth 10. Not 0, but 10. The 10 thus maintains its face value like all of the other numbered cards. And Jack, Queen, King, which would be 11, 12, 13, just become 10 in that case. So all of these count as 10. Most all written rules that you'll find if you go searching or at a casino are generally going to say that these are worth 0. But you will see sources that call them 10. So I just want to put that on your radar, because if you are watching videos, someone may tell you that these are worth 0, and then Grab my other cards back. One of the hands might be a 10 and 6, and you'll hear someone say, that's 16, so I have 6. Well, if 10 is 0, then it would never make sense to get 16. So the context there is that some rule sets consider these to be the value of 10. So some people just say 0 and 6. Some people are going to say 10 and 6 make 16. But because we always drop the tens digit, that becomes a 6. So whether you think of these as a 0 or 10, because when we total and we always drop the tens digit, they're always effectively going to be 0. And thus, I think for most people, the most straightforward way to think of it is just to consider these cards to be 0. Now, why I'm on this tangent a little bit is there are different variations of Baccarat, of course, and then different casinos will have the rules stated differently. But if you hear some of the explanations, they can be misleading depending on what other information you're told. For instance, some people will tell you that when you total up your cards, you subtract 10 from the total, which generally would work, but if someone has told you these are worth 10, if you got a jack and a 10, you would say that's 20. If you subtract 10, that would give you 10, which is not a valid score. Subtracting 10 is not the way Baccarat is totaled. You drop the tens digit. Remember, it is the modulo operation. So, again, this seems like kind of a winding tangent, but you will hear people say it both ways. And so I just want you to understand whether you consider these to be 10 or 0, and I still tend to think of them as 10 when I first do my totals, you will get the same resulting score as long as you drop that tens digit from your total. But if you just think of these as 0, and if you have a 2-digit number, you drop the first digit, you will never go wrong in your totals in a Baccarat game. Remember, pretty much any game you're going to play, the dealer's going to do it for you. But it helps to know what's going on to keep them honest. Alright, so that was a bit of tangent into how we might think about the scoring of these cards. And I couldn't find sort of clear documentation that this is the case, but my theory is that these originally were considered to be 10. That way you can just say all number cards have their face value, and the cards higher than 10 are all just 10 as well. And then because you drop that digit, you get 0. So I think that probably came first, because I don't know why you would add it later to start calling them the value of 10 if your scoring system already worked the way it did with the removal of the tens digit. But like I said, I couldn't firmly establish that in documentation, but that's my theory. They were originally 10, but the way the scoring works, since they effectively always count as 0, it's just easier for most people to think of them as 0. And that's where I will bring us back to the simple. If you think of these cards, 10, Jack, Queen, King, as 0, you won't go wrong. Drop that first digit of any two-digit number to get your score, and you're going to be cruising at Baccarat. Alright, so at the end of the day, not super complicated, but it requires explanation. Now that we've covered how a hand is scored, let's pull a couple hands just to look at that in practice so you can kind of see what I'm talking about on the table here. So we're going to deal out 2 hands. Remember, it's just hand 1 and hand 2. We call it the player hand and banker hand, but those have no specific meaning in this variant. Okay, so let's look at this first hand. Ace worth 1, 8 worth face value, total 9. That is a natural. Unless the banker hand had a 9, this hand is going to win. King, 0, and a 6. So the banker has a 6. Remember, as I said, you could think of this as a 10, be 16. Drop the digit, it becomes a 6. 0 or 10, you get the same result, 6. In this case, a natural wins against the 6. Let's draw a couple more hands just to see. That's hilarious. Almost the same result. Jack, 0, and a 9. Total 9. Again, another natural for the player. Jack, 0, and 6 face value, so that's a 6. 9 versus 6, player natural win. Suits don't matter, only the value of the cards. Since we got almost the same result, let's do one more. Alright, with the player hand, a 0 and 5, that gives us 5. The banker hand has 8 and 4 for a 12. Drop that tens digit, so this is a 2. Alright, so this is a hand where we would draw additional cards. So let's go ahead and dive into that now that you have a sense of how the game is scored. So the good thing about this form of Baccarat is the dealer is going to handle all of the quirks of how cards are dealt in the game. So it takes the burden off of you, but it's still good to know how it works, or if you wanted to play at home. I'm actually going to bring back those cards because it'll help us talk about the situation. So, once the two hands are dealt 2 cards, we take a look to see how the game will progress. If there is a natural, i.e. an 8 or a 9 total, then the hand will have a winner at that point. Whichever hand has the higher natural is going to win, or they could be tied. But bets would be paid out on the basis of that. No more cards are drawn. Now, if there is no natural, then we look to the player hand. And if the player hand is 0 through 5, we will draw a 3rd card. If it is 6 or 7, it will stand. We will not draw a 3rd card for that player hand. So right, we had 5 to 2 here. So 0 to 5, we draw for the player hand. So the player has drawn a 6. 5 plus 6, 11. Drop the digit. This hand is now worth 1. So not the strongest hand there. Remember, we're trying to get as close to 9 as we can. Now the banker hand, after we draw for the player hand, Remember, the dealer's doing all of the dealing in this version. These are just names for the hands, player hand and banker hand. After we've dealt with the third card for the player hand, we take a look at the banker hand. On a 0, 1, or 2, the banker will always draw. On a 7, the banker hand will stand. For 3, a total of 3, 4, 5, or 6, whether the banker hand takes a third card is based off of what third card the player drew. So this is where the game gets a little bit confusing, because whether you draw here depends on specific values of the player card and the current value of the banker hand. I'm going to explain. This happened to be a straightforward case. The player draws. The banker has 2, 0 through 2. The banker always draws a third card. In this case, a 5 for a total of 7, which beats the player's 1. All right, so let's go through some of the scenarios. If the player, their first 2 cards, if it's an 8 or a 9, that's a natural, right? The game will stop. On a 6 or 7, the player stands. 0 through 5, the player will always draw. The banker hand. If the player stands, does not draw a third card, i.e. the total was 6 or 7, the banker draws according to the same rules as the player hand would have, i.e. on a 0 through 5, the banker will draw. 6 or 7, it will stand and not draw. If it was an 8 or a 9, that would be a natural, and the hand would stop based on who won at that point. So, if the player does not draw, banker draws under the same rules as the player hand would have, on a 0 through 5. If the player hand does draw a third card, the banker always draws if it is 0, 1, or 2 in total. If it is 7, it will stand. Now, this is where it gets fun. If the banker hand totals 3, it will draw a third card if the third player card is anything except an 8. Okay? I'm going to show you a chart in just a moment that lays this out. I'm going to put that information in the description box as well. If you're at a casino, they will also have printed rules available that will explain these. Remember, the dealer knows this and it's going to always deal the cards according to this, though they can make mistakes. But let's keep walking through it. If the banker hand totals 4, he will draw a third card if the player's third card is a 2 through a 7. The banker's hand is 5. He will draw a third card if the player's third card is 4 through 7. And if the banker's hand totals 6, he will draw a third card if the player's third card was 6 through 7, a 6 or a 7. Okay? It sounds a bit confusing. It is, I think. It requires some memorization. So that is why I've prepped this chart. Right, the player will draw on a 0 through 5, stand on a 6 or 7, 8 or 9 is a natural. If the player stands, banker uses the same rules. Draws on a 0 through 5, otherwise stands. When the player draws a third card, then we have to look at our chart for what the banker hand will do. 0 through 2 always draws. So remember, if the player stands, a banker draws on 0 through 5. If the player draws a third card and the banker hand is 0 through 2, always draws. So no matter what the player hand does on a 0 through 2, the banker is going to draw a card. And no matter what the player hand does, the banker has 7, the banker hand will stand, not drawing any cards. So 0 to 2, it's always going to draw. If the banker total is 3, then unless the player's third card is an 8, the banker is going to draw a third card. So if the player's card is 1 through 7 or 9 through 0, 0 being 10 or a face card, Jack, Queen, King, right? The banker will draw. Banker total 3, don't draw. The player has an 8 for a third card. If the banker total is 4, we'll draw a third card if the player card is 2 through 7. If the banker total is 5, he will draw a third card. The player third card is 4 through 7. And if the banker total is 6, he will draw a third card if the player third card is a 6 or a 7. So let me tell you how I break this down for remembering it. So if the banker has a 0 to 2, always going to draw. If the banker has a total of 3, I think I look and see if the player has an 8 for the third card. If he doesn't, I'm going to draw. When it comes to the banker having a total of 4, then it's going to be 2 through 7. And so the way I remember 4, 5, and 6 is to remember that it's even numbers in terms of where the valid card starts. So 4 goes from 2 to 7, 5, 4 to 7, 6, 6 to 7. So 2, 4, 6, and stopping at 7. That 8 is kind of that marker where you don't draw on the 3. So I just think total 3, look for an 8, and then it's 2 through 7, 4 through 7, 6 through 7, and then of course on a 7 we'll stand. Alright, so a chart like this, there's different ways to draw this up. This was very helpful for me. It's going to be necessary to help understand how cards are dealt out in the game. So it just takes some memorization and you get a feel for it pretty quickly. But again, let's draw some sample hands to look at this in practice to get a better feel for it on the table. So let's deal a player hand. And and a banker hand. Jack and a 4, 0, 4. Player has 4. Banker has 6, 0, and 6. So we start with the player hand. 0 through 5. Yes, we draw a third card. In this case, it's an 8. Player has a total of 2 against the banker's 6. So the banker total is 6. So we draw a third card if the player's third card is 6 through 7. It's an 8. So we do not draw. And in this case, the banker hand would beat the player hand 6 to 2. Banker bets would pay out. All right? Let's do another example. Ace, king. This is a 1, 1 and 0. King and 2, 2. So we have 2, 2, 1. 0 through 5. Player draws a third card. In this case, a 6, making a total of 7. The banker, having 2, always draws a third card. A 7, making for 9, which is ideal and going to beat the player 7. Banker bets pay out. So you might be asking, why this crazy dealing scheme? And it is entirely based on the odds. That's what gives basically the closest to even chance in the game. And that is one thing people like about Baccarat. It is essentially a coin toss. It's very close to 50-50. It has basically the narrowest house edge of any game in the casino, right? Because you are basically betting on that coin toss. With this dealing pattern is a very slight edge to the banker hand to win. And that is why there is a 5% commission on banker bets. Tends to pay out more, so the house takes 5% back. We'll play some rounds with betting in just a little bit. But let's get this kind of scoring and drawing under our belt a little bit more. But it's because of the odds that it has the prescribed pattern. We're going to talk about some variations where there was choice about the draw, but because the choice is so prescribed by the odds, it's like you might as well just do it anyway. All right, so player 2 9s, that's 18. Drop that 10th, that's an 8. So we have a natural 8 for the player. 8 and 4, 12. That becomes 2. So the natural 8 for the player wins. We don't draw any more cards. We pay out our bets. All right. 0 to 0. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Both are going to draw. 8, good hand. To 4, player hand wins. queen and 2, that's 2, 0 and 2. 8 and 4, 12, that's 2. Again, both draw. 0 to 5, gonna draw. Always draw on 0 through 2. 10, so it stays at 2. 6, this would be an 8. Banker hand wins. 8 to 2. All right, 9 and 4, 13, gonna drop to a 3, so we drop that first digit. 0 to 5, the player always draws. 0, so the player has 3. Now the banker had 7, and the banker stands on 7, wins 7 to 3. Banker bets payout. Maybe try one more to see if we get a slightly different result. Five to 0. 5, 0, 6, 11 becomes 1. The banker has 0, always draws 0 through 2. Stays on 0. The player hand wins. All right. Player has 5. He would normally draw, but we have 1 and 7, 8, a natural 8. Hand stops here. Banker would win. These have all been pretty straightforward. It's when you get those banker totals in the 3, 4, 5 range that we have that more complicated behavior. Let's try one more. Right. Player has 4 and a natural 9 for the banker. Banker would win. Nine and 7, 16. It's a player 6 versus a 7 for the banker. Player stands on a 6. Banker stands on a 7. So in this case, we don't draw any more cards. And the banker hand wins 7 to 6. A 7 for the player, a 7 for the banker. We have a tie because they both stand on 7. There are no more cards drawn. So this hand would result in a tie. Tie bets would pay out. Player banker bets push. So we've looked at how the game is scored for the hand totals, and based on that, how cards get dealt out. So let's do a couple sample hands where we just have some betting going so you can just get a feel for the game overall. So let's just give some chips to our players here. All Alright, so the first thing that's going to happen is players are going to make their bets on player or banker. So let's just say this player bets on the player, and this player bets on the banker. Once all bets are in, we will deal the cards. Alright, so the player has 6, 0, and 6. A player stands on a 6. Banker has 1, 1, and 0. So always draws 0 to 5 if the player stands. So we draw a third card. Another ace to make 2 versus the player 6. So player hand has 1. So we're going to pay out 1 to 1 for the player bet, and the banker loses their bet. Alright, again bets player, and again bets banker. All bets in. Three for the player, right? 3 and 0. 15, 5 for the banker. Player is going to hit 0 to 5, so they will take another card. And that is a 6, which gives them a total of 9. Very good. Banker total right now is 5. And if the banker total is 5, and the player has drawn a third card, the banker draws if that card is 4 through 7, which it is. So we draw a third card for our banker, leaving them with 7, 15, 5, 2 gives us 7. So the 9 of the player wins. Right? So we would again pay out 1 to 1 for that. The banker bet would lose. This time this player wants to bet on banker. And this player will bet on the tie. All right, for the player, we have 7. The banker has 3. So the player stands on a 7. If the player stands, banker draws 0 through 5. So we're getting a third card. And it remains 3. 7 to 3. Player bets win. So that banker bet was lost, and he lost the tie bet as well. All right. Gonna bet banker. Gonna bet player. Okay, what do we have here? 8 and a 1. That is a natural 9. could be a winner. The banker has 6 and 3, also a natural 9. So in this case, it is a tie. A tie is a push for player and banker bets. Players keep their bet. Ignore that I accidentally took their chips. Alright, do a player bet and a banker bet. Alright, we have 8 for the player, 0 for the banker. No more cards are drawn because we have that natural 8. The player bets win. This pays out 1-1. Banker bet loses. A player bet and a banker bet. A natural 9 for the player and a 2 for the banker. Player bets win. Alright, player and a banker bet. Right, 10, 0. And the banker has 6. So the player is going to hit on a 0 to 5 for a total of 4. Since the banker total was 6, the banker takes a card if the player card is a 6 or a 7. In this case, it's a 4, so the banker does not take a card and is going to win 6 to 4. So, the banker bet pays out 1-1, except there is a 5% commission to be paid back to the house. So normally your dealer is going to keep track of what each player owes, and then you can pay it when you leave the table. You can generally request to pay it as you go, but typically the dealer will keep track for you and you pay at the end. So it's really paying 95%, but 1-1 with a 5% commission for winning banker bets. I hope that has given you a sense of how to play Baccarat. It's fairly simple. You're just betting on which hand will win. Hands are trying to be the closest to 9. They score from 0 to 9. Some quirks in that scoring and how the cards are dealt, but once you get a sense of it, it all comes together quickly. Your only action is to place a bet. It is a game of chance. Which hand will be dealt out as the winner? The odds are very narrow, very close to being a coin flip, roll of the dice. However, as a game of chance, people's view of luck comes into it. And that's something you might experience as you get involved in the game. As you engage in social play, you might find there are various conventions around it or desires for people to play in a certain way based on how folks perceive luck. Luck is a belief system, so do with it as you will and how you want to engage with it. All I can tell you is that mathematically it is really basically a coin flip and you can't influence it. That is just the raw mechanics of it, but for some people, part of the fun is thinking about the luck aspect. And so one thing I want to cover for you, just to help you understand things that you might see as you're playing the game, to give you kind of a comprehensive view here, is that people like to track, not everyone, but some people like to track the flow of winds between the hands to get a feel for streaks that might be happening, patterns in the cards. And you'll see that represented in different ways. And I'm just going to describe one of them, what I think is the simplest form. Some get quite complicated and sort of beyond the scope of this video. But I want to prepare you for this, because if you're playing online, you might see this tabulated. You might see other players at the casino with these sheets. Casinos usually give them out for players. So I'm going to do a little demonstration here. I'll put up probably a visual example on the screen of more what you might see online, but it's pretty easy to represent with my chips here just to give you a sense of it. So let me grab some blue chips and some red chips and a couple green ones. And so basically you're going to see a grid layout, usually about 6 squares in height and fairly wide. And what players are tracking is whether the player hand wins or the banker hand wins, or if there's a tie. And why the grid is laid out in these columns is that basically as long as one side keeps winning, you stay in that column. So let's say the first hand is a player win. I would mark it. If the next hand, the player hand also wins, and the actual terminology for hands in Baccarat is coup. So on the next coup, so I guess you could say that players tracking this way are counting coup. But if the player hand wins twice in a row, you're staying in that same column. These are my columns, these are my rows. You'll see this, I'll put it up on screen. Then if the banker hand wins, I go to the next column, and I'll mark it red for the banker winning. Player hand wins, I'll go to the next column. Another player hand, stay in the same column. Another player hand, and then there's a tie, which I will mark in green. Then we get a banker hand win. I'll mark in red. Another banker hand win. I stay in the same column with my red. I get a player hand, moving columns, and then a tie. And then another banker hand, again shifting columns. So they'll build up this view of how the hands have played out. Right? This was a streak of player hand, a longer streak of player hand, a tie. And this is how they get a feel for how the shoe is playing out. I don't advocate you use this method. I want to remind you that it's a game of chance. The casino still has the edge. But for some people, this is how they like to engage with the game. And if you're playing Baccarat, you're probably going to see it, and I want you to understand what's happening. And if you want to do it yourself, you can do this simple method, or you can dive into some of those more complicated variants. All right, so I'm going to put these chips back, and let's talk about some of the variations of Baccarat. When it comes to variations, it's easy to get confused in the terminology. And I want to tell you, I am not an expert gambler. I'm not an expert on the history of casino games. So I did a bunch of research to try to clear things up as much as possible for you. But there are elements here that I can't claim to be definitive about. So I want to think of it more as kind of setting you on a path to more understanding. Definitely, if you want to play these variations of the games, get the rules for the casino you're playing in, understand their exact rules and social conventions that might exist for these variants of the games. Some of these you'll be able to find, some less common. So I just want to be clear about that. I like to be able to speak very definitively when I do a video like this, but there's some conflicting info out there if you dive into some of these questions. I think some of it's just sloppy writing, some of it's the variants and rules, and some of it's maybe some carelessness. And then just historically, these games have changed too, so it can be a little bit murky. But we're going to dive a little bit more into what some of these terms mean. Baccarat is really kind of an umbrella term. And some of these other variations, Mini-Baccarat, Baccarat, Big Baccarat, Mini-Baccarat, Punto Banco, Chemin De Fer. There's Baccarat Bank. They maybe historically were separate games. Sometimes they're just rule variations. Maybe some like Chemin De Fer has kind of evolved into the way we play Baccarat today. So the separateness of these games versus being variations, I'm going to try to sort it out for you as best we can. But we're going to look at these variations. We're going to look at Big Baccarat, Punto Banco, and Chemin De Fer. And that's a good place to start because I've shown you Mini-Baccarat, and you'll notice the dealer deals all of the cards, handles all of the work of who wins, and how the betting is straightforward. Players are betting against the house. But if you've watched one of those old James Bond movies, you'll be like, it seemed like a skill game. People were drawing cards. They're passing the shoe around. What is going on? So a variation of the game, which I think is generally considered to be a predecessor or ancestor of our modern form of Baccarat, Chemin De Fer. It's a fairly old game, dating back probably hundreds of years, is what they are playing in those early James Bond scenes. Ian Fleming actually describes the rules in Casino Royale, and I think that's probably the easiest way to learn the game, so why don't I just read it to you? So, I've said we would call this game Chemin De Fer. If you hear Sean Connery refer to it, say Thunderball, he'll say Chemin De Fer. The title of the chapter in this book is The Game is Baccarat. So, you can see where some of the confusion can come in. This is probably generally just what he thought of as Baccarat and how it was played then. But this is how he described it, and I say tongue-in-cheek when I say this is the easiest way to understand it. If you've ever played Vingt et un, where the object is to get the cards from the banker which add up more closely to a count of 21 than his do. Blackjack, Vingt et un, 21. In this game I get 2 cards and the banker gets 2, and unless anyone wins outright, either or both of us can get 1 more card. The object of the game is to hold 2 or 3 cards, which together count 9 points, or as nearly 9 as possible. Court cards and tens count nothing, aces 1 each, any other card its face value. It is only the last figure of your count that signifies, so 9 plus 7 equals 6, not 16. The winner is the one whose count is nearest to 9. Draws are played over again. Now, Bond continued, when the banker deals me my 2 cards, if they add up to 8 or 9, they're a natural, and I turn them up and I win, unless he has an equal or better natural. If I haven't got a natural, I can stand on a 7 or a 6, perhaps ask for a card or perhaps not on a 5, and certainly ask for a card if my count is lower than 5. 5 is the turning point of the game. According to the odds, the chance of bettering or worsening your hand if you hold a 5 are exactly even. Only when I ask for a card or tap mine to signify that I stand on what I have can the banker look at his. If he has a natural, he turns them up and wins. Otherwise, he is faced with the same problems I was, but he is helped in his decision to draw or not draw a card by my actions. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about the odds. So, not confusing at all, or based on the rules I went through earlier, most of what he said is what we're already familiar with. The way the cards are scored. You're trying to get from 0 to 9, the closest to 9 wins. All that was described the same, but the nature of drawing the cards and the dynamics between the actual player and the player serving as the banker are different. So, what is going on here? Well, in this version of the game, it is a player-banked game. It is not backed by the casino, the house. So, when you play Chemin De Fer, one player who's willing to put up the money to be the banker to match the other player's bets will become the dealer, and they play the banker hand. Next, players have the option to face the banker solo by declaring Banco. So you might hear that in the movie. That means I'm going to put up all of the money and the banker and I will face off 1-to-1. Remember, it's no longer the house, it's player versus player. One playing the role of the banker, the other making the bets against them. If no one player wants to go it alone, then the players go around the table putting as much money as they want up to the stake that the banker has agreed. So if he said $500 and 5 players put in 100, then it would match and they would play the hand. If more players want to bet than the banker has money, I think customarily the banker could add more, or those players' bets are not accepted for this hand. So quite different in terms of how the betting is handled because the player is banking the game, who has volunteered to be the banker. Then, just the way we've looked at Mini-Baccarat, 2 hands are dealt out of 2 cards each, the difference being they go face down and are not revealed to the table. The player and the banker are the ones who know what the values are. Now, unlike our version, where no matter what, the cards are always dealt according to the same rules, the player and the banker can choose whether they draw a 3rd card. Now, here's where this type of game is challenging for me, and I think for most people, and why it evolved into the form it did. As Bond described it there, he basically said, you only have the choice to draw if you have a 5 as your total. Because below that, you definitely should draw. Above that, you definitely should not draw. So the only choice is on the 5. Now, apparently some casinos would let you draw if your total was other than 5, but pretty much all of the people you're playing with, since their money is also at stake for your decision, they want you to play the odds. So the only real choice was on the 5. Now, I've read an odds study that says even in that case, you should always draw. And if you look at the Mini-Baccarat rules, the player always draws on a 5 because it is the better odds. So you can see the conventions of the game because of the odds. There is no real choice, so why preserve that choice? But you do get some unpredictable results if people are going to make that decision or not. And that's where you could say there was skill, but really it was driven by the odds. So in some of those games, Bond is mostly rolling the dice. Sometimes you could say it's a skill element to bet on the 5 or not. Now, with the player drawing, then the banker also has that option to draw. And you could say there's some strategy for the banker there, but there's really, again, only kind of 2 scenarios where there's actual choice. And again, I think the odds, well, there's a reason that it's become a prescribed dealing. So that's probably a little bit confusing. I think, with that game, you're going to have basically the way it would work. You play that hand, and if a player hand wins, then the banker passes the shoe to the next person who is willing to put up the money. So that shoe is going to move around the table based on who is willing to stake the bank. They will play against all of the other players or whoever is willing to put up the money. If multiple players have made bids, the player making the highest value bid is the one who's going to play the player hand. If they go Banco, they're the only one in the game. There were also rules for if players bet the same amount of money. If you hear someone say suivi, means follow, and they're saying based on that set of rules, they would be the one who's going to play. More complicated game, but I want to emphasize as we talk about these variations, the core concept of the scoring in which hand wins is unchanged. These differences are really about who is dealing the cards and how the bets are made, okay? So if that is a way where unusually it is a player-banked game, the shoe is going around the table and different players are dealing, and there's some choice, but the odds say that there really isn't a lot of choice. It's a lot of complexity, and I think the appeal was it tended to be a high roller game. It feels like a very social game, right? That's why we see it in those Bond movies. It feels like a very classy and exciting experience, and it's people staking a lot of money on essentially a die roll. So, but if you think about playing that in a casino, I think those are reasons why it's evolved into the way it's typically played in most casinos now, where it's a prescribed set of dealing rules, and it is a house-banked game. So that's where we get into Punto Banco. So in Baccarat, you would have the banker, and then the players are the punters. So Punto Banco is basically Spanish player bank. Straightforward. And this is a variant that evolved in South America and Cuba, and it's kind of a more casino-friendly version. And in this case, the game is banked by the house, and the cards are always dealt according to that prescribed system, which is based on the odds to get as close to 50 as possible. This makes for a much more regimented game. It's very clear. There's no unusual moments of chance with the player making that choice. And it's simplified. You don't have to have the players decide who's going to put up the money for the bank. The casino handles it. So, in that sense, the version of the rules I taught you is Punto Banco. It is a house-banked and prescribed version of the game. So, if the shoe is passing around and a player is banking the game, it's probably going to be Chemin De Fer. And if it's more in the style that we've looked at, American, it's generally a Punto Banco version of Baccarat. And you'll see people refer to, oh, when we play in America, it's the Punto Banco version. That's kind of become the dominant version that just has those elements. You're not usually going to a table to play Punto Banco. you're going to play Baccarat, but it's under that constraint. Okay? Chemin De Fer, player-banked game, some choice in the dealing of the cards. And that's what you'll see in those movies. A similar and kind of maybe contemporary, maybe older version, it's one of the earliest written rules, is Baccarat Banque, like the French spelling of banque, B-A-N-Q-U-E. And it is very similar to what I just described, except the table is split into two halves, and each half kind of makes that bet against the banker. So the banker is actually playing against two different hands. But I think plays out very similarly otherwise. It's just you now have three hands in play, a player hand on each side of the dealer or banker. All right, so those are going to be uncommon versions of the game at this point. So let's talk about Mini-Baccarat, which is the rules that I've taught you, versus Baccarat or Big Baccarat, as you might hear it called, and then kind of a Goldilocks variant called Midi-Baccarat. So I believe these games have been kind of in a state of flux in Vegas. So you would have the Mini-Baccarat table. So if you see one dealer, a few seats, the dealer's handling all of the cards. Players are not interacting or touching with the cards in any way. It's all prescribed by what the dealer does. They're just making the bets. Mini-Baccarat. And there would typically be, usually in the high roller area, a big Baccarat table. And there you would tend to see 3 dealers and up to 14 seats for players, so a much bigger operation. And there, although the game would be played by the prescribed rules of how the cards are dealt, and it would be a house-banked game, effectively Punto Banco rules, the shoe might be passed to let players deal the cards themselves. Players with the most money serving as role of banker and player. And so you get the feel of that older game, but without that player choice element in the deal. And so that would be big Baccarat. If you see the shoe being passed at one of those big tables, if you see your players potentially handling cards, that would be big Baccarat. Now, I think that's generally being phased out at this point in favor of a dealer actually doing all of the dealing of the cards. No more passing of the shoe. But in honor of those who make the largest bets, they may be given the cards to reveal to the table. There's no actions in terms of draw. They just get to be the ones to show the cards. The dealer would respond and deal cards accordingly. So all are the same constrained rules, but maybe a little bit more player interaction. And then you get Midi-Baccarat, which is kind of in between. So there you're playing on the smaller table with one dealer. They're going to deal all the cards in a prescribed fashion. Again, players are just making their bets, player, banker, or tie. And the difference is, like we were just discussing with Big Baccarat, cards for the player banker hand may be given to those who are betting the most, and those players again get to reveal the cards. And this is where I'm going to talk about another quirk of the game that Baccarat can have in those scenarios. It might be surprising if you play something like poker. I'm going to grab a random couple cards from this deck. Let's say I had bet on the player hand and I had the largest bet. I might be given the player cards to reveal. And you will see players actually bending the cards to look at them first. This has no impact on how the game is going to be played other than for players, this is a kind of dramatic way of engaging with a game of chance. They're not going to change how the cards are dealt or anything, but it's a little bit of a convention where players will actually bend the cards as they reveal them, and so you'll end up with a bent and damaged card. And it's nothing more than a convention that has evolved in the game where players get a more dramatic element from the reveal rather than just flipping them over right away. Of course, these cards won't be used again. All variants of Baccarat play with somewhere between 6 to 8 decks, generally pulled from the shoe. These cards aren't going to be used again, so if you see players doing that, that is what is going on. It's a bit unusual, so I feel it's worth noting. And again, that's just whoever has the largest bets will get to be the ones to reveal the cards, but the dealer is still going to be the one who is dealing according to the prescribed rules based on the odds. All right. So that is an explanation of some different variants of Baccarat. I do want to call out one more thing before I kind of wrap up. We've talked about the player bet, the banker bet, and the tie bet. The tie bet paying out 8 to 1. At different casinos, you may see a number of different options for other bets that you can make. And the important thing is to learn the rules of the casino you are at. If you can bet on more than one thing, what things can be bet on based on what other bets you've made. A common one is to bet on a pair, either a player pair or a banker pair, and that means on the first draw, if you happen to draw a pair on these first two cards, for instance, let me mix these up. So 2 10s, this would be a player pair, and the pair bet pays out 11 to 1, or it might vary slightly based on the specific casino you're at. Similarly, a banker pair would pay out 11 to 1. Sometimes there's an either pair, it might be 5 to 1. And then there's more complicated bets, sometimes like for the banker total to be 6, either a 2-card 6 or a 3-card 6. Those can pay out, in larger amounts. There are certain combinations that some casinos will allow bets on that can have higher odds. Again, just remember, those are way better odds for the house than for the player. So keep that in mind as you make those bets, but those can be popular with players, giving some different options. There's some other variants, like you might hear commission-free Baccarat, and there, instead of paying the commission on the banker bets, if there's a certain total of cards, like a 6, say if the banker wins on a 6, then you only get a half payout on your bet. Things like that. Again, I'm not going into detail on all these different variations because it's going to vary casino by casino what all of the rules are. Right, so that is a pretty big overview of Baccarat, specifically Mini-Baccarat. and some other variants, kind of more historical variants, and some of the things you might see in casinos. But remember, at the end of the day, you're making a bet on whether you think the player hand will win, the banker hand will win, or a bet on a tie. And then you might have some other options like pairs at a casino. Once bets are made, 2 cards are dealt to the player, 2 to the banker. Those 2 cards will be revealed. You will score, remember, ace 1, 2 through 9, face value of the card, 10 through king, 10, jack, queen, king, count for 0. When you add it up, you drop the tens digit. So 4 and 2 is 6, 5 and 4 is a 9. Remember, after you draw the first 2 cards for each hand, if you have a natural 8 or 9, the game ends, the hand ends at that point, or the coup, as it is called in Baccarat. In this case, we had a natural 9 for the banker. That would win, and banker bets would pay out. If there are no naturals, then the player will draw. The total is 0 to 5, otherwise stand. If the player stands, banker, same rules, draw on 0 to 5, otherwise stand. If the player draws a 3rd card, the banker will draw a 3rd card based on what that was. Other than 0 through 2, always draw. 7, always stand. If the banker total is 3, draw a 3rd card. If the player card is anything but 8, banker total 4, draw if the player 3rd card is 2 through 7. Banker total 5, draw if the 3rd player card is 4 through 7. And banker total 6, draw if the 3rd player card is a 6 or a 7. A little bit to remember. Again, you'll pick it up quickly. I'll put some information in the description box below. But that is the game of Baccarat. Hope you give it a try, or next time you see it played, you'll at least understand exactly what is going on. I hope you have a wonderful night.